Chelsea McKinley is the plant health specialist at the U.S. Botanic Garden. She manages the Integrative Pest Management Program, as well as helping gardeners identify and solve plant health issues in their collections. Chelsea has worked at the garden since 2014, previously working as a gardener in the horticulture collections team, caring for the medicinal and Mediterranean plant collections. Before joining the garden, Chelsea worked as the assistant grower at Green Street Gardens, the operations manager at the University of California, Santa Cruz greenhouses, and as a research associate for Syngenta Flowers Lawn and Garden R&D in Gilroy, California. Chelsea has a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Horticulture Science from California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. We're excited to have her with us today, taking your plant health care questions. So take it away, Chelsea.
Hello, everybody. So glad you could be here today. I'm happy to answer all of your questions. As Libby had mentioned, I help with all manners of plant health care here at the gardens. We have gardeners who take care of our various collections, so I help them with basically all of their plant health problems, right? They come to me with questions about what's going on with their plants, and I try to solve them. I also oversee our pest management program. So Libby had mentioned integrated pest management. So what goes into that is, first identifying the pests that we have, and then coming up with a treatment plan for those pests. So it might include pesticide applications, beneficial insect releases, or changing something culturally that is wrong with the growing conditions for the plant.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us. So can we just start with, let's see, how do you prevent your houseplants from rotting?
So that's a great question. That is a very common issue in plants that have been overwatered. So typically you want to make sure that your potting media is well draining, and that your pot is also well draining. So your pot needs to have holes in the bottom of it. So if your pot doesn't have holes, that's probably what's wrong with it. And you want to go ahead and transplant your plant into well-draining media into a pot that has holes in the bottom of it. And when you water, you want to make sure that there's at least kind of 10% of the water that you're putting onto the plant is coming out of the bottom of the pot, and that pot is being allowed to freely drain. So sometimes when I'm watering my plants at home, I might move them into my sink or my bathtub or something like that and water them, let them freely drain, and then put them back in their spot. You can kind of give them a shower at the same time if you want, hose off any dust, and sometimes that can also help with managing pest issues as well. And another issue with rotting plants is that it's not always initially overwatering that causes it. Sometimes if a plant dries out too much, so it becomes very, very wilted, and then it gets too much water after that, is when you start seeing the rot. And that's because you had a lot of root death when it initially dried out. And so those roots aren't there to take up the water anymore. And then it's much easier to overwater a plant that had previously dried out too much. So you want to be careful if something had wilted or dried out a lot, and just kind of let it, nurse it back to health, water it when it's just starting to dry out, and not just keep saturating the soil. You really want to make sure that you're only watering your plants when the top centimeter or half a centimeter of soil is starting to dry on the surface. And that'll really help not only with rot, but then also keeping down fungus gnats and other soil issues that you might have.
Well, it's funny you should mention fungus gnats, because we definitely had a question about that. So how do you get rid of these flying beasts? We've used sticky pads, neem oil, chemicals, repotting, and watering, or not watering. So if you could help with that.
Yeah, so fungus gnats, probably one of the top issues for houseplant care. So you really want to start out with, letting the soil dry out fairly thoroughly between each watering. That'll help culturally control the larvae that are in the soil feeding on your plant roots. And then what you can do to control the adults, like you said, sticky traps will help, but ultimately you really want to control the larval stage in the soil, and that'll help prevent them from continuing to emerge. So one thing that I recommend to a lot of people, especially home growers, is diatomaceous earth. And so this is a material that you can place on the top of your soil. It acts, it's not a chemical, it acts through, how should I phrase this? Sort of mechanical action. So when the adults are trying to emerge out of the soil, they get all like cut up from this diatomaceous earth that's like slicing up their exoskeleton. I know it sounds really gnarly, but it works on all sorts of pests. So you place a very thin layer of it, and you want to completely cover your soil surface because you want to make sure that whatever insects are emerging are touching this material, right? So it's not a systemic insecticide, it's just mostly acting when it comes into contact with the pests. Some people also use hydrogen peroxide. I haven't seen that work quite as well, but it can be used as well to try to control that larval stage that's in the soil. And then again, you want to make sure your soil's freely draining, drying out in between waterings, and transplanting can help sometimes as well if you're able to rinse off the root ball. So try to get rid of as much of the organic matter as possible when you're transplanting. So you take it to a sink, you take it to the trash can, get all the loose soil out, and then take it to your sink or take it outside and hose off the roots and try to get as much of that soil off as possible, and then put it in some fresh media. And that'll help with getting rid of any of the larval stages. And it's worth noting that if you have a lot of houseplants, you probably want to put diatomaceous earth or transplant all of them at the same time, so that way you don't have, say, one plant that's kind of the typhoid Mary that's spreading to the other plants as
well. That's a great tip. That's awesome. We're getting lots of questions. So we did have somebody ask about humidity levels, like what should the humidity of your room be when you're growing houseplants, and how is it best to get there?
Yeah, so I know a lot of home growers use humidifiers, especially during the winter months, because our environments can dry out so much from heating and things like that. And that can be beneficial for both you and your plants. It's hard to recommend a specific humidity level, not knowing, what plant species specifically you're trying to grow. A lot of tropical plants prefer higher humidity levels, although many of the houseplants that are sold as houseplants that you can find, at many different retailers typically can withstand the lower humidity levels that are found in homes. So typically you don't need to worry about humidity as much with those sort of standard houseplant species. However, if you're growing something more rare or exotic, you want to look into the cultural requirements of that particular species before you bring it home and try to grow it. And ultimately, that'll help with any issues you'll have down the road. If you know what that plant wants and it's not getting what it wants, it'll probably have some issues related to
that. Awesome. Do you recommend putting drainage stones or clay beads or those sorts of things into the bottom of pots? Is it better not to? This person has heard arguments kind of both ways.
Sure, yeah. So that is a very common misconception among home growers, that adding a layer of stones or broken pot pieces or even perlite or some other type of coarse media underneath your potting soil at the bottom of the pot, that does not increase drainage. If anything, that creates a sort of water pan at the bottom of where your soil ends. So when water is traveling through soil, it travels through capillary action. So the capillary action of the water gets disturbed when there is a change in media type, when there's a drastic change in the porosity of your soil. So if it's going from like, smaller porosity in your, peat light mix, in your standard potting mix into a more coarse media, you'll actually get more water held in your soil than if the whole profile of the pot was filled. And you can do an experiment at home where you take a sponge, right, and you saturate it with water, and you hold the sponge like this, and then turn it on its side, and you'll see all this water draining out of it. So the sponge, no matter which direction, is the same exact volume, but you've changed the way that the capillary action is happening. So when you take a tall pot and you put coarse media at the bottom of it, you're not only limiting the amount of substrate, you're also changing the way the capillary action is happening in that soil as well. So ultimately, taller pots will provide better drainage than, say, like a wide, short pot will. And you can try that at home with that sponge trick I just talked about.
That sponge trick is great. Cool. Fun new thing to try. And a follow-up on drainage. If one of your pots doesn't have drainage holes, how do you know if you've overwatered? If there's brown spots on the leaves, plants like a fern that only have a couple of leaves coming out, sort of those sorts of things. But I guess let's start with if you don't have drainage holes, how do you know if your plant has been overwatered, or what can you do to deal with that?
Yeah, so if your pot doesn't have drainage holes and you really like the pot, I'd recommend maybe finding a plastic pot with drainage holes that will fit inside of that decorative pot that you like. And that way you can at least transplant it into that plastic pot and then, still have it on display in the porcelain pot that you like, in the pot that doesn't have drainage holes, and be able to take it out and drain out any excess water, or take it out and water it in the sink or something like that. So that's how I deal with decorative cover pots that don't have holes. But really, ultimately, any plant that is planted in a pot without drainage holes has a very limited life. You really need a special sort of terrarium setup to be able to deal with the situation, deal with the water that's accumulating. Because ultimately, all that water that's just hanging out at the bottom of your pot is going to be a breeding ground for pathogens and root rot issues. So I just recommend just not growing plants in pots without holes.
Good call. Thank you. So here's a question about water versus light. So my bird of paradise is turning brown around the leaf edges. I can't figure out if it's related to light or water.
So I'm guessing that they want to know how to figure that out.
Yes. Yeah. So how do you determine that?
Yeah, so that is tricky. It's hard to know without looking at the plant. So typically birds of paradise do prefer brighter light. So it could be a combination of factors. So it could be that the plant isn't getting enough light to take up the water that is being given to it. So if say it was in a brighter environment, it wouldn't be getting overwatered, if that makes sense. So the amount of light and then also the temperature that a plant is exposed to will affect how much water that it takes up because of photosynthesis, right? So it could be getting overwatered because of the light, it not getting enough light. And you can tell if a plant is getting overwatered if there's a root rot issue by taking the plant out of the pot that it's in and looking at its root ball. If there aren't a lot of white, healthy roots in the root ball, if it's really soft and mushy, that's an indication that you have a root rot issue and that your plant's getting overwatered. Typically with birds of paradise. They are fairly drought tolerant. They're grown in California and the landscape, things like that. So I would just let that plant completely dry out in between waterings, and that will probably help with any issues that you're having. And then maybe also just making sure it's in a bright, sunny spot as well.
Fantastic. So we had a question about keeping an avocado plant alive. So it's been growing for over a year. It has really drooping leaves. They've replanted it and added fresher soil and a mix to it. But do you have any suggestions for things that has kind of items like an avocado that would have drooping leaves that you're seeing, and how to care for that?
Sure, yeah. So if your plant looks wilted and the soil is wet, then that's definitely an indication of some sort of root rot issue, or some sort of vascular issue, or particular pathogen or something like that inside of the vascular system in the plant that's disturbing that water uptake. So the plant is in fact wilting because it's not getting enough water, but that's not because the soil's not wet enough. It's because the roots or the vascular system aren't functioning properly. So in that case, I would recommend maybe starting over with a new avocado seed. Vascular issues in plants are very difficult, if not impossible to cure. If your avocado plant has any branches that you could prune off, you can look and see if there's any brown on the inside of the stem. There might be like a little like brown like half circle, or part of it might be brown on the inside where it's supposed to be white. And that's an indication that you have a vascular issue or a vascular disease. So if it's, sometimes plants become wilted or droopy just during very hot times of the day where they aren't able to transpire enough to keep up with cooling. So if it's in a very, very hot, bright, sunny spot and it's just wilted during that part of the day, I would say don't worry about it too much. But if it's wilted looking throughout the entire day and the soil is staying wet, then yeah, probably a vascular root rot issue.
Good to know. Thank you. We had a couple questions about overwintering. Someone who brought in a climbing bleeding heart vine to overwinter. It's too big to easily take outside to water. Do you have any suggestions? Do you think it'll bloom inside, or does it need any sort of fertilization?
Yeah, so typically if you're overwintering a plant that's not actively growing while it's inside in the house during the winter months, you probably just need to very minimally water it. Water it when it completely dries out. And it definitely doesn't need any fertilizer. So you don't want to be fertilizing plants that are not actively growing, because that can actually damage the plant roots, because the plant is like, oh, there's all this salt around my roots and I don't need it. And then the roots just kind of like shrivel up. It's like if you eat something really salty, and your lips kind of like start to shrivel up and pucker a little bit, but then you don't have any water to like rinse it out. Think of that's what's happening to your plant roots if you're fertilizing them when they're not actively growing. So that can actually be an entry point for diseases and pathogens during the winter months if the plant's getting over fertilized during the winter months. So I would say don't worry about fertilization, but do try to water it if you can.
So this is kind of similar. This person has 2 Plumeria that they overwinter and take out seasonally. They think it's time to repot. They're also wondering, can they do something about the odd shape of the plants at this time? And if so, how? Like, is this a good time to do that?
Yeah, so Plumeria is great because it can go pretty much completely dormant during the winter months. If you let it dry out, it'll drop all of its leaves, which is totally fine. It'll make a comeback in the spring. I would say you could do some pruning to help with its odd shape. If it's a crooked stem or something like that, you could try staking it and, bracing it against the stake, kind of like how you would, fix a broken leg or something like that. But it's tough with Plumeria because they do have very succulent, tough stems. So it might not be anything that you'll be able to fix. You could just look at it as a very unique plant shape and appreciate it for its uniqueness. But yeah, Plumeria, you can definitely let them completely dry out during the winter months. You could probably just like throw them in a corner and not worry about them if you are planning on growing them outside during the spring and summer.
Awesome. So let's go ahead next, and we're going to do a quick poll. So you guys will notice here, you'll get a poll that will pop up here shortly, I believe, hopefully. And it's really just true or false. Oh, where's my question? There it is. True or false? Do most houseplants grow in the soil? So if you don't see the poll, you can share in the chat what you think, true or false. But otherwise, there it is.
Can I answer this?
Give us 1 second. We'll show the response. Oh yeah, if you'd like to respond to the poll, by all means, Chelsea, go ahead. All right, so it looks like we got most people saying yes, a handful of people saying no. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And wow, what's the answer, Chelsea?
So the answer is no. I know this is a little bit of a trick question, but maybe some of you people who have taken soil science classes or something in the past might know about this. But so soil is what is found outside in the ground, and it is a conglomerate of living, breathing microorganisms. It has a lot of mineral matter, lots of sand and clay, things like that, and it has a very, very small percentage of organic matter. Whereas potting soil or potting media, which we actually like to call it in the industry, is mostly organic matter. It's mostly peat moss, bark, things like that. So it's not actually soil. It's a completely different media. And it is designed to provide sort of this optimal environment for your plants to grow in. Because you're growing them in this artificial environment, right? You've taken them out of the ground and you put them in a pot and you stuck them in your house to grow. So they need to adapt to that sort of environment. And so potting media is designed to allow their roots to grow more optimally than, say, if you were to use soil in that pot. Soil is also much heavier, so it can make moving large pots around more difficult. Soil, like I said, has a bunch of living organisms in it, whereas potting media tends to be sterile, which can be good because you don't want to be introducing pathogens into your plant root zone. We don't want any of those root rot pathogens that we were talking about. And then potting media also tends to be much more well draining as well. So again, it can help with root rot. And people who might like to water on a frequent basis, things like that.
So since we're talking about soil and potting media, what about fertilizer? Like, when is the best time to fertilize? Should you fertilize things annually? Things like avocado, bird of paradise, palm, agave, a lot of those sorts of plants. What are your thoughts on fertilizer?
Yeah, so it's definitely great to fertilize your plants when they're actively growing. So that will be in the spring and summer months for most plants. If you're in a Mediterranean climate, it's a little bit different. You have some plants that grow during the winter months. But first of all, you need to know your plant, right? Like get to know your plant, do some Googling, find out its scientific name, figure out like where it grows in the wild, and that'll give you a huge clue as to what it wants, both environmental wise, like light, temperature, humidity, and then it might also tell you something about its nutritional requirements, right? So if it's a tropical plant that grows in a rich tropical forest floor, it's gonna love having some pretty rich fertilizer when it's actively growing. It's gonna want more nitrogen because it has these big lush leaves. versus something like a cactus that grows in the desert isn't going to need as much nutrition because it doesn't experience that in its native environment, right? So you want to get to know your plant, and you definitely want to keep an eye on it and look at those signs of new growth. Look for new leaves unfurling, little buds coming out, things like that. And then that's when you want to actively fertilize. And it's important to note too that most fertilizers, especially the water-soluble kind that you might get from a home goods store or something like that, will have 3 numbers on the package. So the 3 numbers stand for the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium content. And those are the macronutrients. So those are what the plants need the most of. And you really want to make sure that it's a good ratio. And recent research has shown that too much phosphorus, so that middle number, if that's really high, that will actually cause your plant to elongate and have longer, leggier stems. So you want to find something that maybe has lower phosphorus content, and that'll help keep your plants more compact and more adorable, in my opinion. And then the nitrogen, typically you want the nitrogen number to be either equal or a little bit higher than the potassium number. So those 2 N numbers, you want the first one to be a little bit higher or equal to potassium. And then just make sure that you read the label and follow the directions. More is not always better. Remember what I was saying about, like the winter roots getting too much salt? That can be true any time of the year if you're over fertilizing. So you want to make sure you're giving just the right amount of fertilizer, not too much.
Awesome, thanks. We have a question here about plants in the containers themselves. Like, how do you know when a plant is getting too big for the container that it's in?
Sure, yeah. So one indication is that the plant falls over. that happens to us sometimes here. We're like, oh, we probably need a bigger pot for that plant. Another indication can be if you start seeing circling roots in the root ball. So you can pop that plant out of its pot, take a look at its roots. If all you see is roots and you don't see any soil, that is definitely an indication that you need to transplant. So if it's getting close to that ratio, still you can transplant. Some plants do like to be crowded, so a lot of epiphytes like to be crowded in their pots, like orchids and bromeliads, things like that. So with those, you could probably leave them for a long time until, like I said, they start falling over or branching out, sending roots out of their pot and search for other pots, things like that. But typically, you want the pot to provide a good stable base for the plant, right? So you want it to keep it upright, and then you also want it to provide enough water and nutrients for the plant as well. So if the pot's too small, your plant may be drying out very frequently, so more than once a week, and that's an indication that you might want to transplant and put in a slightly larger pot.
What sort of tips do you have to get plants to flower? So we had a specific question about a Hoya, but any sort of tips for getting plants to flower indoors?
Yeah, that can be tricky. Some plants do have certain environmental requirements that they need to meet in order to flower. So it might require them to experience a little bit of cold before they will initiate flowering. Sometimes it's a nutrient requirement, things like that. So I'd recommend looking online, seeing if there's some sort of flower initiation growth requirement for your particular plant species. And then, seeing if you're able to meet that requirement at home. Like with orchids, a lot of them do flower better if there's a little bit of cold. And that's why you see a lot of orchids flowering during the winter months. So something you could do is put them up against a window where they might get some sort of radiant cold heat from radiant cold from the outside, and that might help them initiate flowering.
Do you have any thoughts about Clivia and how to get that to thrive indoors as opposed to just sort of being sort of status quo from year after year?
I'm guessing Clivia.
Yeah. Sorry, yes, Clivia. Yes.
Yeah, those can be tricky plants. They prefer a very coarse, well-draining media. So you want to make sure that they're planted in maybe like a chunky bark mix, something like that. Maybe, some charcoal, things like that. So they shouldn't be planted in like a very fine, typical potting media. You probably want like an orchid blend or epiphyte blend or something like that, and plant them in that. And they don't like a ton of sun. So if they get too much direct light during the day, that might kind of burn their leaves a little bit. And yeah, again, I would say just kind of look them up, look at their growth requirements, see what they love and what they hate.
That's great. Would you say the same thing for a fiddle leaf big plant? This person that was asking about optimal levels for watering and light related to the fiddle leaf big.
Yeah. So they can get very large. So they typically tend to be very, very large trees. We actually have one in the tropics room here at the conservatory that's probably 40 or 50 feet tall. So they do like a lot of light. And they are from the tropics, so they prefer kind of more moist soil. But I still would recommend letting the top of the soil dry out a little bit in between waterings, just to make sure you don't get any fungus, gnats, or root pathogens. And then fertilizing them when they're actively growing. And they typically are pretty slow growing plants, so just be patient with them and appreciate them for how they are. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. What about thrips? How do you control thrips on your plants?
Sure. So I think, did I send you any photos for thrips? Yeah, if you wanna put those up, see which ones. So these little buggers, they're not actually bugs, they're insects. These little insects are very much a nuisance. And so for those of you who don't know what a thrips is, and that's how you properly say it, singular is a thrips. Entomologists are weird. They are very much a nuisance pest on a lot of houseplants, and they can come from the outside. So I would make sure, so exclusion is the number one priority, right? So you want to make sure that you aren't bringing them outside, inside. Say if you have an exterior garden, something like that, you want to, make sure you kind of decontaminate yourself if you've been gardening outside before you come inside. Take off your clothes, take a shower, wash your clothes, all that stuff. If you already have them on your plant, it's good to know that there are kind of two major life stages of the thrips. Do you want to put up the life cycle diagram? So thrips feed on the leaves when they're immature, so in their instar sort of larval stage, and then also as adults. And they also lay their eggs inside of the plant tissue, right? So you can spray oil, insecticidal oil or insecticidal soap to control thrips on the plant foliage, but then you also need to think about controlling the pupa that hang out in your plant soil as well. So what happens is they pupate, the pupa kind of just fall off the leaves and into your plant soil, hang out there for a few days, and then emerge as adults. So this is why thrips can be so difficult to control. We deal with them a lot down here at the conservatory and a lot at the production facility as well. So when you're controlling an infestation, you want to treat the above ground thrips and then also the pupa that are in the soil. So If you could go back to that diagram again one more time. So the life cycle takes about 2 weeks or so. So it takes them, about a week to 2 weeks to go from egg to adults. And then the adults will live for 30 to 45 days. So that's a whole month of this adult, flying around, laying eggs inside your plants. So what you'll likely need to do is treat consecutive generations if you have them on your plants. And so I typically recommend 3 treatments of insecticidal soap or insecticidal oil 7 to 14 days apart. And that kind of depends, their life cycle will speed up if it's warmer, and it'll slow down if it's cooler. So it'll be closer to the 14-day if it's kind of cold in your house. It'll be closer to the 7-day if you keep it pretty warm. And so that's 3 treatments, 7 to 14 days apart, each treatment. And then for the soil, you can use the diatomaceous earth that I was talking about before. You can also buy nematodes as well. So there are these beneficial nematodes that you purchase online. You want to make sure you get them from a good dealer. Otherwise, they might not be alive when, when you get them. And what you do is you mix them into water, and then you water them onto your plants. And that is Steinernema feltiae is the scientific name of those nematodes, but you can also look for nematodes for thrips control. These will also control fungus gnats as well. So going back to the fungus gnat question earlier, you can get these beneficial nematodes, and I'd say if you get them, water all your plants, because again, we don't want that typhoid Mary hanging out in the corner, vectoring these pests onto your other plants. So yeah, that would be my recommended treatment plan.
Awesome. I think we're going to jump into our next poll. So you see it pop up here, but are spider mites insects? And if you don't see the poll on your screen, you can answer in the chat as well. But jump in and let us know if you think, are spider mites insects? True or false, yes or no? Oh man, it's like a split crew right now. Give it another second or two for people to respond. Right, so it looks like we're kind of evenly divided here with people who responded 50-50 yes and no spider mites to being insects. So what's the answer there? Are they insects?
No, spider mites are not insects. They are arachnids. So all insects have 6 legs when they're adults. Arachnids, so spider mites and other mite species, have 8 legs when they're adults. And this means that they function very differently. So a lot of insecticides that work on insects won't work on spider mites because they're not insects, they're arachnids. So if you are using a chemical insecticide for treatment of your plants, you want to make sure that you first know what insect you are trying to kill and whether or not it is an insect or an arachnid, and then make sure that that chemical that you're using will work on that particular insect or arachnid. So if you do have spider mites, you want to make sure that you're using a miticide. And there are a couple different systemic insecticides out there on the market that are marketed towards homeowners. So there's some of the so this is a picture of 2-spotted spider mite, and this tends to be the most common, and it is called 2-spotted because of its 2 spots. My pointer is so small. There's 2 spots on either side of its abdomen. So these are 2-spotted spider mites. And if you have 2-spotted spider mites, that is good because at least you're able to identify the particular mite species. And that also means that you might be able to get a predatory mite. Persimilis is the name of the predatory mite, to help control your spider mite populations. Now, if you have a bunch of webbing on your plant, Libby, do you have the picture of the webbing? this is a sign of very severe spider mite infestation. So if it's to this point, you probably want to spray your plant with some oil. Horticultural oil will work on spider mites, or horticultural soap will work on spider mites, or simply water too will help knock them down. So you probably want to spray them before you try to release any beneficial insects. You can also just do a couple applications, again, 7 to 10 days apart to get those different life stages, to try to treat your spider mite infestation as well if you aren't planning on purchasing any beneficial insects. But again, going back to the insecticides, if you plan on using a systemic insecticide that's targeted towards homeowners, make sure you read what the active ingredient is, because there are a couple that I wanted to talk to you guys about. There is imidacloprid, which is very, very common, commonly marketed as like maybe the little granules you sprinkle on your houseplant to cure systemic infestation. And so that will not work on spider mites. If anything, that type of insecticide has been shown to increase spider mite fecundity. So fecundity is like how much they reproduce. So it actually like speeds up their reproduction. So if you apply those granules to try to take care of a spider mite infestation, you might actually make it worse. So you want to know what that active ingredient is. There's another one that will take care of spider mites. It's acephate will be the active ingredient. However, I do not recommend this particular chemical if you have children or pets that like to get into the soil of the plants, because this particular chemical, acephate, is a neurotoxin for mammals, so it's highly toxic, and you really want to make sure if you are using this chemical that you follow all of the instructions on the label and you use gloves whenever you're handling the soil, things like that, because it will actually disrupt your cholinesterase, and so that can lead to issues down the line. And they actually discovered this was an insecticide while they were testing it out as a nerve agent. So beware of acephate if it's in your products. Be very, very careful. Imidacloprid is much safer. It's a neonicotinoid, but again, it's not going to work on your spider mites. So you want to find something that's specifically labeled as a miticide, or just stick with hort oil and horticultural soap.
Awesome. So we did have a question earlier. Someone was asking about their begonia and Cuban oregano that they brought inside, and they got mealybugs. Do you have any idea where the mealybugs came from?
Yeah, that's tough. It's always the question, like, where did these come from? My plant was fine like 5 minutes ago, and now it's covered in mealybugs. So I can't say where they came from. If the plant was outside, then the mealybugs could have been hanging out on another plant and just kind of crawled over. But in terms of preventing this from happening in the future, I would definitely highly recommend that you carefully inspect any plants before you bring them inside for the winter months. So if you're going to overwinter things inside, take a real close look at them, flip them over, look at the undersides of the leaves, look at the pot, because mealybug will hang out on the pot sometimes. They'll lay their egg sacs on the pot, and then when the conditions are right, those egg sacs will hatch. So you also want to make sure that you wash any pots that you're reusing very, very well. So sanitation is very important. You want to wash those pots well, and that'll get rid of any insects that might be hanging out on them, or any pathogens that might also be hanging out in the pots. And in terms of treating the mealybug infestation, insecticidal soap works pretty well. Again, you'll probably have to do a couple consecutive treatments to get those different life stages. So the soap will work well on sort of the younger, smaller mealybugs, and then you'll have to get the next life stage, any of those eggs that hatch later on. So you want to do a few consecutive treatments.
Thank you. We did have a question. So somebody was talking about how their aloe got too heavy and it broke off at the stem in their pot. Can they get it to regrow at the roots in the new pot, or what is the best solution then for them for a plant like aloe that's gotten too heavy and broken off?
Yeah, so succulents are amazingly easy to root. So that's the good news, right? So your aloe, if there was a portion remaining in the pot, like if any of the stem was still in the pot, then that might regrow. That might shoot up some new aloe leaves. And then the part that broke off, what the succulents have a very cool adaptation where they will sort of cauterize or seal off any wounds after they break off. So if you want to root a succulent, it's best to cut them and then let them dry out for a little bit, and then you try to root them. So once that cut end has dried out, then you want to stick it in some soil and begin watering it. Don't overwater it, but water it when the soil's dry, and eventually it should start to grow roots. You also want to remove any leaf pieces that might go below the soil surface, because the leaves aren't going to root necessarily. Some succulents they do, but you're basically just trying to get the stem to regrow roots. So you want to remove any leaf pieces, and that'll help it keep it from rotting, and then also kind of give it these sort of exit points for the roots to come out of the stem where those leaves were.
Awesome, thanks. We had a question about soil. How to pre-treat soil before using it to plant. So if you're worried about that it might have some eggs or something in it, how do you pre-treat it, or how do you find soil that maybe is egg and insect free, harmful insect free?
Yeah. So most potting soil that you buy from a home garden center or something like that will typically be sterile. You want to make sure that the bag doesn't have any holes in it, or it's not like super wet or anything like that. But most potting soil is already sterile. If you're trying to use old potting soil or mix your own, you can sterilize soil and other organic matter either through steaming it. So you get a little basket steamer and put it in a pot, just like you would steam some artichokes or something like that. And you can steam your soil on your stove. If it's a ton of media, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. You could do a few different batches. But I would say, if you let it steam for 15 to 30 minutes or so, it should probably sanitize any pathogens and probably kill any microbes that might be in the soil. You can also bake things as well at a very low temperature. I know some people do that if they're, sort of gathering organic materials for use in a terrarium or something like that, and they don't want to introduce any pathogens. You can bake things in the oven at a very low temperature. Just make sure you stay nearby. You don't want anything catching fire. And again, like the lowest temperature that your oven will go at. And you can bake it for 25, 30 minutes. And yeah, but typically I would recommend just starting with new fresh potting soil. That's probably your safest bet.
That's a great tip. Thank you. So there is a plant behind you. This guy right here, I'm going to show a picture. I think this is the Santherium, and it's got some deformed leaves, I believe. Did you want to talk a little bit about what to do if you see this happening with your plants?
Yeah, so this is a sign of thrips damage. So we had talked a little bit about thrips before and how to treat them, but this is let me see if I can get the pointer up. So
it might be tiny again. Yeah, sorry.
So these brown necrotic spots on the flower, and then how the flower is kind of deformed, and then also on the leaf as well, how this leaf is kind of deformed, and there's these sort of necrotic dead spots on the leaves as well. So these are signs of thrips damage, which is different than signs of spider mite damage. So spider mite damage is more of like a silvering, sort of dusty appearance. Yep, there we go. There's some spider mite damage. And so this is more of an even silvering, whereas the thrips damage is a little more sporadic to some degree and causes more deformity as well. Yep.
And you also had another plant behind you, I believe, that had some brown leaf tips. Is that right? Some browning. And what do you do if you see this? What does this mean, and what can you do for it?
Yeah, so great question. This is a Dracaena, very common house plant. I think it's also called like a corn plant or something like that, even though it's not corn. So this is a type of monocot, and you know that you have a monocot when you have this parallel leaf venation, kind of like grass. Grass is a type of monocot. Palms are a type of monocot. So you have these parallel veins. And monocots are very susceptible to fluoride toxicity. So fluoride is found in all of our drinking water to make our teeth nice and healthy, but a lot of tropical plants, especially monocots, do not like fluoride. They can tolerate it in very, very small amounts, but not typically at the amounts that are in our city drinking water. So if you start seeing these brown tips on your monocot leaves, or is a sort of edge browning and necrosis, that's likely fluoride toxicity. And a very simple trick you can do to help prevent this from happening is filling up whatever vessel you use to water your plant with water about 24 hours before you water your plant, and letting it simply sit out. And most of that fluoride will evaporate from the water, and then you can use it to water your plant. You can also use distilled or deionized water, but that's much more expensive than just letting your water sit out overnight.
That's great, thanks. We got a question about a Croton. One stalk of my Croton has dropped all of its leaves. The other two still have leaves and seem more or less okay. Should I cut down the stalk completely, or is there any chance it could come back in the spring? I'm thinking I overwatered it during the winter, and that's why all the leaves fell off.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, Crotons can be somewhat finicky. I would say investigate the stem. Take a look at it. Is it sort of more shriveled up looking than the other stems? If so, that's an indication that that stem itself is dead. Is it soft and kind of mushy? Again, that's an indication that that stem is dead. What you can do is if you're uncertain, cut off a little bit and take a look at the inside of the stem. And if it's still kind of white and fleshy on the inside of the stem, then that's a sign that it's still alive, and you could just leave the rest of the stem and it might regrow some leaves in the spring. You also want to look and see if there's a bud on the very tip of the stem. Sometimes Crotons will kind of have this apical bud. And if that still looks like it might have some life in it, if it's still kind of like green or yellow or whatever variegated color your Croton is, and it's still firm, then I would say that stem's probably still alive. And then even if the top half is dead, you could trim off just the dead part and leave the part that's still alive, and that might regrow some stuff in the spring as well. So just take a look, get to know your plants.
Awesome. I think we have time for another question. We have a couple questions here about water. So someone asked, should distilled water be used in all watering? And another person uses a reverse osmosis filtered water, since they have a water softening system that uses salt. Should they continue with filtered water? So sort of this idea of filtered or distilled water for your watering.
Yeah. So one thing to keep in mind with filtered and distilled water is that it can have a much lower pH than your plant might prefer. So we've had this issue down at our production facility where a lot of our growers were using our reverse osmosis water to water their plants. And over time, the pH of the potting soil, because the reverse osmosis was like I think it was like 4 or 5 pH, over time, the soil pH started to migrate towards the reverse osmosis pH. So typically, you want your plants to be growing at like 6.5 to 6.8. So that's near neutral, just slightly acidic. So neutral is 7. But what can happen sometimes with city water is the opposite effect, right? So a lot of city water will be very alkaline, so it'll have dissolved minerals in it that kind of bring up the pH to 7. In DC, I think our city water is around like 7.5 or so. And so that can have the opposite effect where your soil pH might migrate upwards and be too high over time. So you can kind of maybe do a balance of some RO, and you kind of flush out any salts that build up when you water, and then also occasionally watering with city water as well. If you're very concerned about it, they do sell these little like pH probes you can get online where you can measure your own soil pH at home or your water pH. It's just a small electronic probe you stick in water, and so you can take a look yourself if you're very enthusiastic about how your plants are growing. That can be a very sort of insider look into the growing media and what your plants might be experiencing, because ultimately the pH will affect nutrient availability. So if your pH is too high or too low, that might cause nutrient issues, whether it's toxicities or deficiencies over time as well. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, no, that was wonderful. That was great. Yeah. We are right at time. So I just wanted to thank you, Chelsea, for your time today. We've gotten through so many questions. It's been really informative, and I just cannot thank you enough. So thanks everyone for joining us. This has been fantastic.
Yes, thanks everyone for being here. I'm glad I got to answer all your questions. Hopefully some of it was helpful.